as I can.
As long as you can.
Probably an hour.
Vertical injustice, there's something going on in
Good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
Welcome to Historical Society. It's another one of our speaker series. We've been doing real good. We've enjoyed it. We've learned a lot. Today we got Howard Ray Duncan speaking with us. A couple small things. We have some books for sale over there. We're started publishing a couple different books. I don't know how many of you know John B. Lennox. He has some problems. He had brain surgery, but he's doing real good. He got to go home today. So he's home and doing good. So we're all happy for that. We got Wanda with us here today. She's doing good. Yep. So she's been.
I am blessed.
Yes, you are. She's been a lot of help here. She keeps our newsletter and stuff going. We got some free copies of our newsletter over there. Some books we got for sale. We just got a few samples of the ones we got here. So otherwise, everything's been going good, and I'm just going to turn over to Howard and let him do it.
All right. Well, thank you all for showing up. I'll rattle on for a few minutes and give you a bunch of arcane facts and details about the O&W Railroad. But I've always loved history and always loved local history. One of my favorite things was to go over to my grandpa's house and sit on the front porch and have him tell me about when he was a kid. He was born in 1901, and he remembered a lot of this early history. Of course, he'd heard it from his parents and his grandparents before that, going all the way back to the Civil War, and that really got me interested in it. And I specifically was very interested in the Onida and West River Railroad. Now, as a kid, I remembered down here where the old depot is, the tracks were gone. By the time I was born, the railroad has already been pulled out. But I can remember the rails still being embedded in the pavement, and it bump as you go across the rails down there. I can remember out past York Institute, now near where the Pine Haven School is, there was a big overpass there. There were big, huge boulders stacked up on both sides of the road, the big rocks out there, and that was the end of the abutments for the bridge. Unfortunately, when they built the vocational center next to the high school, the new school, they took all those big rocks and a lot of the fill, a lot of the dirt, and buried it under the vocational school, so that landmark disappeared. But I saw a movie one time about the Yosemite Railway, and one of the lines I remembered was that a railroad never completely disappears. There's always remnants of it left behind. And if you look, you can still see it. Now, I remember as a youth going out toward Pickett State Park, and of course, the O&W Railroad eventually made it to Jamestown, and alongside Highway 154, you could still see the cinders and the coal and the cross ties laying on the side of the road where the railroad had just been pulled out. So that wasn't that many years ago that I can remember. The O&W Railroad goes all the way back to 1912. In November of 1912, the Tennessee Stave and Lumber Company, which was headquartered in Nashville, had bought a huge tract of land up in here. They were competing with the Stearns Coal and Lumber Company to cut virgin hardwood timber. They also found out there was a lot of coal in certain parts of the county, especially down on North White Oak Creek. So they needed a railroad to get this timber out. That's the reason there was still timber here in the early 1900s, because nobody could get to it. You couldn't get it out. The terrain was so rugged and so rough, you had no way to haul the huge big logs out. So in 1912, November of 1912, they applied for a charter to build a railroad. Originally, it said it was going to go from Glen Mary to Albany, Kentucky. Pretty ambitious, I guess. But the Stearns Coal and Lumber Company didn't want the competition that they were going to get from the Tennessee Stave and Lumber Company, so they filed a lawsuit against the railroad, saying that the charter wasn't properly certified, some legal technicalities. So they refiled, and oddly enough, it's kind of ironic that originally it was called the Jamestown Railroad Company, was the original name for it. And they had these grand ambitions that they were going to build it all the way from Onida to Jamestown to Albany, Kentucky, and connect to the Cumberland River up north of Albany. Well, it didn't quite work out that way, but they built it in stages over a period of time. They started laying the first track in late 1914 from Onida down along Pine Creek. They built a really nice, beautiful office building, which still stands today in Onida. It's the Cumberland Veterinary Clinic. If you go through Onida, it's right there on the corner. It's a nice, really three-story brick building, and that was the headquarters and the offices for the O&W Railroad. The depot sat on what is still called Depot Street, even though their depot has been gone for years. But that was the beginning of the railroad, where it connected to the Southern Railway at that point. They started laying track down Pine Creek, building a series of little bridges, which mostly still exist, crossing Pine Creek, and eventually, by the fall of 1915, they'd reached the Big South Fork River. That was about 10 miles to get that far. Now, it was pretty rough terrain. There was one huge cut they called the Big Cut. It was over 90 feet deep. They had to blast and dig, and all this was done by hand. They didn't have much in the way of equipment. So they would drill and blast and cart all this material out. They finally made it to the Big South Fork River. Of course, that was a problem. They had to cross the river. So they needed a bridge. So the O&W, being sort of a shoestring operation without a huge amount of funding, bought a second-hand bridge, most likely from the Southern Railway Company. Now, that bridge still stands to this day, and it's called a Whipple Truss Bridge. Now, I won't get into all the engineering technicalities of it, but it has to do with the way the bracing on the bridge. They have what they call panels, which are uprights with an overhead truss, and then you have support rods that come down and cross through two panels to the bottom part of the bridge. That strengthens it. Well, that Whipple truss design was pretty common between 1880 and 1900. So that bridge probably is about 140 years old. Has a lot of wrought iron components in it. They had the bridge cross the river, and it was put up by the Nashville Bridge Company, which I guess still exists in Nashville today. But the Nashville Bridge and Steel Company, with the help of the O&W work crews, actually built the bridge across the river. If you ever look at the bridge or a picture of it, the west side of the bridge is anchored to an enormous boulder, probably bigger than this room, on the riverbank. Now, I've always thought that was just the coolest thing, because a modern engineer would go, oh, that big rock's in the way, we got to get rid of that, and then spend $1,000 million blowing the rock up and building a big concrete pier. But not these guys. Oh man, we can put the bridge right on that rock over there. Well, they did, and it's still standing to this very day. So if you look at it, there's an enormous boulder that they flattened out a spot and anchored the bridge to it. The approach on the east side, the bridge didn't quite fit the space they had to cover. So the approach on the east side was a timber trestle originally. There's a backstory on that too. But that timber trestle was there until 1929, when the biggest flood that's ever been recorded on the Big South Fork River came in March. They still call it the Big Tide. That was a phrase that I learned from early on. When a big flood comes in the river, a lot of the old timers call it the Big Tide in the river. Well, the Big Tide of 29 was in March of that year. And it was a huge, enormous flood. It was so high, and if you've ever seen the O&W Bridge, it's about 100 feet off the water. It washed across the top of the bridge, across the cross ties. The timber trestle on the east side was washed away, and currently there's a steel span that's there today that replaced it. If you ever look underneath the bridge, you can see these big, giant steel bolts anchored in concrete that are bent over, pointed downstream, that washed away that timber trestle. Well, anyway, I get ahead of myself. They built the bridge. By 1916, they were going up North White Oak Creek, and there were several stops along the O&W. Part of it was to collect timber and lumber, because a number of lumber companies were operating down there. Part of it was to access coal mines. Now, I couldn't possibly remember it all, so I made myself some notes here. But this is a list of some of the rail stops along the O&W Railroad. Of course, Onida, 1913, then still exists, a place called, they call it Verdun over there. Some people would pronounce it Verdun. They pronounce it Verdun. Reed Station, a place called Toomey, named after John Toomey, one of the investors of the railroad. A little place called Speck, I found out that Mr. Speck was an investor in the railroad, and got his name mentioned. Potter, Gert, which was reached in 1916. Now, between Gert and Xena was a place called East Laurel. There's a creek there, and local people still call it East Laurel Creek. There was not a railway station there, but there was a work camp. The O&W had 4 section crews that worked on different sections of the railroad, and one of the section crews was housed at East Laurel. So there was a pretty good sized little community there. There was also a coal mine operated there for a short period of time. A fellow by the name of P.F. Legion out of Scott County opened a coal mine near the mouth of Laurel Fork Creek. If you ever get a chance to go down there, you can look up on the hillside and you can see all these concrete foundations and a water tank and all that. There was a tipple that went across and had a spur track come off the railroad so they could load coal at that point. That mine only operated for 3 or 4 years. But from Gert, you went to Xena, then Christian. I found out that Christian has a couple of reasons to call that. One, there was a company called the Christian Lumber Company up on the end of Darrow Ridge, which had a camp up there and a big sawmill. There's still a Christian cemetery up there to this day. They had an incline that came off the mountain and came down to Christian where there was a loading point on the railroad. Excuse me. Same thing with Gert. There was a big incline there. Obviously the Gert Lumber Company was involved in that. From Christian, you go to Briar Point, which was 20 miles from Onida. Hagemeyer, which was 21 miles, was another loading point. Hagemeyer was also one of the officials of the railroad. Actually, he was the vice president and the traffic manager for the railway. Then you had Stockton at 25 miles, reached it by 1918, and eventually they reached East Jamestown in 1921. There was a camp there, of course, that's where Louvain is. Excuse me, and that was also the name of the post office there, was Louvain. The railroad sat there for several years. Part of it was that they were slowly running out of revenue because they had started hauling most of the timber already out. They'd cut a lot of the timber out, but they were also working the mines. So the railroad sat at East Jamestown for several years. An added note is that Alvin C. York, when he was a recruit, as he was leaving to go off to the Army, actually went to East Jamestown from Pall Mall, caught the train there with a bunch of other recruits, and headed off to his basic training in Georgia. So a little bit of connection there. From East Jamestown, the line sat there for several years until people started wanting the line to come on into Jamestown. So the O&W said, well, we really just don't have the money to build another spur line. It was only 7 miles from East Jamestown to the depot down here. So they floated a bond issue. They issued bonds for local people to buy into the railroad and finance that part of it. They didn't purchase, I don't know if you got a mint here, my voice is leaving me. All these allergies are crazy. But, yeah, I've got some water. But I'll get this as well. Just a second, please. Okay, so they floated a bond issue, they raised some money, and they took an easement on property from East Jamestown out along what is now Highway 154. I can remember traveling along the road and seeing the old cross ties and the cinders there from the railroad that came up. They came out 154, came in behind where Mert Blevins lived. He's the fellow that's got a steam engine in his front yard. Of course, Mert's passed on now. Came in behind what was the Walter Dimension Company, then the Kentucky and Tennessee Lumber Company. And there was a station there that was called Hugarth, obviously named after Hugo and Arthur Gert, who had that lumber company there. That was a loading point. Also, there was a mineral that was mined, not really mined, more or less just taken up out of the ground, down in Wolf River called barytes. Barytes was a mineral used especially in World War II because they could crush it and it was used to help make the dials of aircraft, the luminous numbers on aircraft, so it was a war commodity, and it was loaded. There's a picture that exists that I've seen. I've got a copy somewhere that I couldn't find. But there's a picture of a fellow loading these nodules, these clumps of barytes, into a boxcar with a wheelbarrow. Now, it's a fairly primitive operation. They didn't have high-speed equipment then. So they were loading these barytes into the boxcar. From there, the railroad came out behind where the new Pine Haven School is, crossed Highway 127, came in behind York Institute, crossed over the little creek down here, which was behind, well, some of you may remember it as different things, but now there's a liquor store out there. It used to be the White Store. It was various things before that. But a fellow named B.D. Shapiro had a lumber company located right on the railroad there. Also had a sawmill that made barrel staves. My grandpa Peavyhouse worked at the B.D. Shapiro sawmill down there. This is a little personal interest story, but he said that he would walk from Helena down near Little Crab, because this was during the Depression, and he had a car that he had paid for, but he couldn't afford gas for it, so he sold his car, and he was walking from Helena to Jamestown to work in the sawmill for 10 or 12 hours a day, and then walking back to Helena for 15 cents an hour. And he said he finally went to Mr. Shapiro, and he said, you know what kind of a worker I am. You've seen my work. And he said, I just can't make it on what you're paying. He said, we're about to starve. And although they had a little farm down in Helena, they could grow some food, it still wasn't much. And so Mr. Shapiro said, well, you're right. He said, you're a good worker. He said, I'll raise you to $0.25 an hour, but don't you tell these other men. And my grandpa played it just right. He said, well, that's between you and them. But he said it wasn't very long until everybody got a raise to $0.25 an hour. So that was kind of connected. And of course, from there, he went to where the depot still exists today. Now, there's a lot of stories connected to that, and I have some personal stories. One was that my dad said that he and his father, my grandpa Duncan, would cut cross ties and bring him to the railroad to sell down at the depot. He said he remembered his first trip to Jamestown, and the first time he ever drank a Coca-Cola was at the depot down here. Now, they would go out in the woods. Grandpa had about 168 acres down at Fairview, off the side of the mountain there. They would go out, and he said they'd spend one day with a cross-cut saw. Now, this was when he was a teenager. But they'd spend one day with a cross-cut saw, cutting the trees, cut them up to length. Then the next day, they had a tie yard where they'd work on this. Dad would take the mule and drag the logs up to the tie yard, while Grandpa would hand hew the cross ties with a rod axe. Then after they'd made a wagon load, they'd load them up and bring them to town for $0.25 apiece. So imagine that. You got 35 cents if you used a switch tie, which was longer. So standard cross tie was like 8 feet. But anyway, that's a lot of work, but that's what they had to do in that day and time. As an aside to all that, around 1921, well, maybe 1919, when they finally reached East Jamestown, they built a spur track called the Doss Spur, which went out to the north of East Jamestown and out on top of the mountain of what people called the basin. Now, it took me a long time to figure out what that was, the basin. What they were talking about was the drainage basin of Laurel Fork Creek, East Laurel. And that's where the creek heads up in there. And it's a big, huge drainage basin. So they had a spur track that went out there. They had a stave mill set up on top of the mountain. And they built an incline over the mountain and down into Wolf River Valley so they could cut the timber off the sides of the hills down there. They had a narrow gauge railroad that operated and had a large camp down in Wolf River. A couple of other interesting facts. My grandpa that I mentioned earlier, his first job when he left home, he was 15 years old, he went out to work at that logging camp out on top of the mountain above the Wolf River incline. His job was to keep the mules in the stable. He would feed and take care of them and all that. Didn't take him long to get a job working in the sawmill. They were cutting barrel staves. It's called a stave and heading mill. Barrel staves and the head part of the barrel. Everything was shipped in wooden barrels back then. So he became a sawmiller. That's how he learned the trade to cut barrel staves. it's interesting that my other grandfather, who at that point, I don't think they even knew each other, but Grandpa Duncan was working on one of the little Climax steam engines, a little narrow gauge engine that worked down in the valley floor. So he was a fireman and a brakeman on one of those little steam engines, while my other grandfather was working on the top of the hill at the sawmill. So, also, my Uncle Cordis and his wife Olive, on their wedding day, rode the incline from the top of the mountain down into the valley, down to the camp where John Taser had a general store down there. The incline lasted until about 1925, when they cut all the timber out. Didn't need to exist anymore, so they pulled everything back into East Jamestown. Well, the railroad was based on resources mostly, hauling timber and hauling coal. Now, if you've ever looked at the old depot down here, you'll notice in behind the depot is a big stone wall. There's a reason that's there. Now, the part of the depot that we commonly see from the highway is not the part where the railroad was. The railroad was on the other side of it. That's where the tracks were. And that stone wall was built not only as a retaining wall to keep the hillside from coming down, but that was a loading point. There were a lot of small coal mines out in this area. They call them truck mines. So they would haul the coal by truck up to the depot. They would drive up on top of the big stone wall. The rail cars, the gondolas, would be sitting right against the wall. They would lift the bed and dump the coal right in there. So they didn't need a coal tipple. My dad tells a story, we did when he was still with us, but he said that there was a fellow down there one time dumping a load of coal and backed up a little too far, right to the edge of it, and as he started to tip the bed of the truck up, the whole truck just slid over backwards right on its tailgate into the rail cars. The guy finally made his way out of the cab of the truck, and he said, well, I guess that dumped her, didn't it? So apparently he wasn't hurt, and the truck wasn't hurt too bad. The railroad had a crane that they would use to move things around, and fortunately that crane was able to lift the truck out of the coal car, as everything was okay. The railroad was actually very important for commerce in this area in the early days. Before the highways really existed, everything was a gravel or a mud road. Travel was slow, automobiles weren't that dependable. You could ride from Jamestown to Onida or Onida to Jamestown. At first, they offered passenger service. They had old passenger coaches that they would bring in 2 or 3 trips a day, the height of it in the 20s. And then, of course, when they finally made it to Jamestown in December 10th, 1930, was when they first came to the depot down here, you could take a trip from Jamestown to Onida, which would take about 2.5 hours for the one-way trip. You could go shopping over there, and then hopefully you'd have a round trip coming back. In the later years, as passenger service dwindled off, and cars became better, and roads became better, they started having a series of motor cars, and there were several of these. Motor car number 1, number 2, number 3, number 4, number 5. Most of them were converted automobiles or trucks that were set up to run on the railroad tracks. The most famous one was motor car number 4. M4. The M4 was a gasoline electric. It was made with the Brill Motor Car Company, and I've seen a picture of it when the O&W bought it secondhand from a railway in, I want to say in Connecticut. It was called the Greenwich and Northwestern. I've seen the inspection photograph, and it clearly says across the side of it, Greenwich and Northwestern. So it had a gasoline engine that powered a generator that operated electric motors, so it was totally independent. It could run by itself, didn't need a locomotive. That became the primary passenger service between Jamestown and Onida at that time. The problem was, in later years, they only made 1 trip a day. So to go from Onida to Jamestown and then back to Onida. So if you were here and you went over there, you were stranded for the night. So that didn't work out too well. But the M4 was also the way that the mail was delivered. The U.S. Postal Service had a contract with the O&W Railroad to deliver the mail on that motor car, and they would haul it from Onida to Jamestown. There's a picture that I shared here with that I found in the Tennessee Conservationist magazine, which shows motor car number 4 at the depot, Sergeant Alvin C. York, and 2 new recruits headed off to World War II. And so that's an interesting photo, and I'm sure he'll wind up sharing it as I just sent it to him. Well, the fortunes of the railroad began to falter in the 30s. Of course, the Depression hit, coal prices dropped, lumber prices dropped, people weren't building things like they were, and the railroad kind of began a series of declines over the years. Most of the equipment they bought was worn out when they got it. It was all used equipment except for one steam engine, and that was engine number 20, which was built in 1912 by the Baldwin Locomotive Works. It was ordered specifically brand new for the Onida Railroad. But it turned out that number 20 just didn't quite have enough power to pull the loaded cars. There was a big grade coming up from North White Oak Creek up Hill Creek to East Jamestown. That was a pretty steep climb, and they needed a powerful engine to get up through there. And the number 20 just didn't quite have enough power, so they sold number 20 to the Lehigh Valley Railway Company up in New Jersey, believe it or not. That engine still exists. It was in use as late as 1973 as part of a scenic railway. That engine still exists as part of the collection for Steamtown National Historic Site in Scranton, Pennsylvania, which is property of the National Park Service. So it's still there. You can go see an old O&W engine. There's another engine that existed on the campus of college in Jasper, Alabama. It was just sitting there, static display. Neither have operated in years. As the railroad began to decline, the trips became less and less frequent. Toward the end, they were making maybe 2 or 3 trips a week instead of 2 or 3 trips a day. Of course, there was less stuff to carry. I can remember my dad talking about when he was younger, a young adult, that he remembered seeing cars, automobiles coming in on flat cars on the railroad. He worked at a Kaiser Fraser dealership here in Jamestown, and he said they would bring new Kaiser automobiles in on flat cars and offload them at the depot and take them to the dealership. So it was an important link between the two communities. The O&W was slowly declining. Business was coming to an end, less stuff to haul. Coal mines were playing out, timber was being cut, equipment was worn out. So they actually requested the right to abandon the rail line. Now, back then there was something called the Interstate Commerce Commission, which controlled railroads in those days. So you had to apply to abandon a railroad because it was a public service. And before they could complete the right to abandon the railroad, the O&W was purchased by the Crown Healy Construction Company. Crown Healy was a construction company out of Chicago. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers was proposing to build a big dam up at Wolf Creek. And they were going to use the railroad to haul cement as far as Pine Haven. But unfortunately for Crown Healy, World War II interrupted. The project was put on hold until after the war. When they rebid the project in 1946, Crown Healy lost out. And so here they had a railroad that they had no use for. The railroad was then sold to the Jewel Ridge Coal Company. The Jewel Ridge Coal Company still had hopes that they could open some new mines and continue mining in Zenith and in that area and produce coal. Well, that didn't work out as well as they'd hoped, but all of the cement that went into Wolf Creek Dam was hauled over the O&W Railroad from Onida, from the Southern Railway to Pine Haven, offloaded on trucks and taken over to the construction site. I mentioned my dad a lot, but he's told me a lot of these stories. But he actually worked on the construction crew that built Wolf Creek Dam. His job was setting forms on the spillway, on the big concrete face of the dam. And he said they would offload these sacks of concrete on trucks and truck it across to Wolf Creek. It was the closest railroad and the cheapest way for them to get the materials they needed. So all of the material that went into Wolf Creek Dam, all the concrete, came through here. That was the last big job for the O&W. It was the last year they actually made a profit. It was I think it was in 1948 by that point. And after that, it just continued to go downhill. There was less and less reason for it to exist. The track was getting grown up in bad shape. The bridges were not as good as they were. All their equipment was getting worn out. So in 1953, they applied again to the right to abandon the railway. The last trip that motorcar number 4 made from Onida to Jamestown was in June of 1953. That coincided with the end of the mail contract. So that was the last time. There's a picture that exists that shows a group of people riding motorcar number 4 on their last trip. The railroad was actually given permission to abandon in early 1954. I've had 2 conflicting dates on this as I've researched it, but it's either March the 10th or March the 31st or 30th was the last trip for revenue made between Onida and Jamestown. After that, the railroad was sold for scrap, and a salvage company out of Texas actually bought the steel rails. They used the O&W section crew, the same crew that had maintained the track over the years, to help lift the rails off and load it onto the flat cars and haul it off for scrap. I always thought how sad it must have been for those men that had worked so hard to maintain that little railroad, then having to be the ones responsible for dismantling it and taking it apart. So after that, the railroad ceased to exist. Most of the equipment was sold off for scrap. The locomotives, as I said, were worn out, and all the rail cars were in such bad shape they couldn't be reused. Motor car number 4 sat for years over on a siding. The last remaining piece of the O&W Railroad was a set of tracks that went back, and that's where it connected in to the Southern Railway. But motor car number 4 sat there for years on that siding, and I remember seeing it just a shell of the old motor car. It's not there now. I don't know what happened to it, but it finally disappeared. But there's a couple of humorous stories related to the O&W as well. They never had any major accidents, although they did have a derailment on the big bridge over the Big South Fork River. The caboose and a couple of their cars came disconnected from the locomotive and somehow managed to jump the track and went over into the river. So that was pretty much a disaster. Luckily, no one was hurt. The people on the rail cars managed to jump out as just the train crew, so they were able to jump off, and somehow they managed to pull that wreckage out of the river. The other one is kind of a funny story. There were some of the executives of the railroad, some of the managers, had ridden the railway over to Jamestown. Of course, if you look at what's left at the depot, you can see on one end of it, there's a 2-story section. Well, that was an apartment up there. That's where the station master stayed, but also had a living quarters up there for the railroad officials. So they'd made the trip, an inspection trip across the railroad, came over to Jamestown, and were heading back the next day. Well, it come a big rain that night, and somewhere down along the North White Oak Creek, a little trestle had washed out. Now, again, I've heard some conflicting information on this, but they had an old car that had been converted to use on the rails, had special wheels on it. One account I read said it was a Model A Ford, but that doesn't quite make sense if you know something about old cars. I think it was a Model T Ford. The Model T Ford had what was called a planetary transmission. It was basically 2 speeds. You had all these pedals in the floor. The throttle was actually up on the steering column like a tractor. And that was the way you controlled your speed, by giving you gas. On the floor, there was a low and a reverse pedal. And your low pedal, you had to hold down to put it in low gear. And it would automatically go into high when you released pressure off of that pedal. Well, I think they were using a Model T Ford. But anyway, they came to this washed out trestle, and everybody looked at it, and they could see the track still kind of sagging down into nothingness. And they decided that it was not safe enough for them to travel across it in the car. So what they did was they had one fellow walk across the track on the other side. I suspect they probably took a stick and put it down on that low gear pedal, set the throttle just a little bit, and let that car ease its way across. And he was supposed to catch it on the other side. But guess what? He missed. Somehow that stick came loose, the car jumped into high gear and took off down the track and went all the way into Onida, where it crashed into a boxcar over at the depot in Onida. And here the railroad officials were standing there with no way back, so they had to walk to get out of it. I always thought that was a good little story. The workers on the railroad love to tell that story on the big brass, the leaders up there. But anyway, railroads never completely disappear. There's always some sign or some evidence of them having been there. There were towns and communities all along that railroad that are now just place names. There's virtually nothing left of where they used to be. But there's remnants of the railroad. We have the depot here in Jamestown, the big steel bridge over the big South Fork River. There's some bridges going back to Onida over Pine Creek. As a matter of fact, one of them is closed right now because it's been there since the early 1900s. And the state inspects those bridges just like they do any other bridge, and they condemned one of them and said it was not safe to cross. So the O&W is at least temporarily closed. But before that happened, you could drive down to the big steel bridge over the big South Fork River. So the O&W is all that's left are just memories. And the entire generation that once operated that railroad are all gone now. And it's up to us to remember that history and that legacy. Just a small piece of American history, but a great big piece of local history. So remember the Onida and Western. Don't remember it like people did back then. Toward the end years of the railroad, they started calling it the old and weary and the old and wobbly. It was so worn out. So don't remember it that way. Remember it as the proud little railroad that it accomplished a great deal with very limited resources. So it was an important part of our local history. I thank you all.
Anybody got any questions for him?
I got one over there.
What are they gonna do with the depot, the old depot, are they ever gonna,
That's what I want to know.
have you heard any?
I don't know, I haven't heard. I know there have been numerous attempts to get people interested in preserving it, restoring it. I don't know the background on what's going on with it. I don't know what it would take to, as you can see, it's slowly deteriorating every day. And it's a shame. It's a shame to see it disappear. It's one of the last remnants we have of it here. So. And needless to say, the railroad never made it to Albany. It only made it as far as Jamestown. Anyway.
That was my question.
That was your question?
Yeah.
Oh, thank you.
Anything else?
Everything seemed possible back in those days, you know?
Somebody else had it over there.
Uh-oh. Yes, ma'am.
Listen, you may have already talked about some of this stuff, but I have such a hearing loss that I didn't hear you. Did you know that the cement that was used in the Wolf Creek Dam up in Jamestown, Kentucky, was hauled down the slope, that steep slope going down to Pall Mall, and then was loaded onto trucks and taken to Jamestown, Kentucky for the construction?
Yep. I've always heard that it came to Pine Haven, to the loading point out there. The incline was already gone by the mid-1920s.
We have a write-up from Doyle Jones in the newsletter that gives the details of this. And I am delighted that we have that. I know it's in the newsletter, but I can't tell you where. They went down the incline, went to the basin up on the top, and went down the incline, but the big cars that the cement was loaded in was too heavy to get down the incline, so they had to take that cement out, load it into 3 different cars to get it down to the base, to get it down the incline, and then when they got it down there where they could unload it at Pall Mall, they still had to get it into trucks to take it to Pall Mall. I mean, it was just a hassle to get all that done. And another little comment, my mother's family lived at Zenith for a while, and she would tell about one of the engineers coming up the railroad, and when he got to a certain place, he would start playing music with the steam engine. He knew how much steam to release to get the tune, and I can't remember what song it was, but it was Amazing Grace or another song that's it's not coming to me right now. But anyway, it's just a few little tidbits like that if we don't have it recorded, it's going to be totally lost.
Well, I will comment on this. You were mentioning the incline. The incline that went down Delk Creek into Wolf River, actually, when they first paved Highway 127 in front of Alvin C. York's house, all of the asphalt was hauled over the Doss Spur to the top of the mountain out there. They used steam from the steam engines to keep the asphalt hot enough to pour out of the cars. They were loaded on smaller tanker cars. The railroad that went down the incline and down in the Wolf River Valley was a narrow gauge railroad. The O&W was a standard gauge, which is 4 foot, 8.5 inches between the center of the tracks on each side. So they loaded it onto these little cars, carried it down to what people, when I was teaching years ago down at Pall Mall, people would talk about the asphalt bridge. Well, there was a bridge over there across Wolf River, which is now no longer in use since they built the new bridge over it. But there are 2 big concrete abutments there that you can tell was obviously used to hold a big tank. And the sides of it are covered with asphalt. Well, that's where the asphalt tank was that held the liquid asphalt, where they mixed the blacktop that was used to pave the York Highway in front of Alvin York's house. Years ago, I was curious about all this, so I made a trip, actually back when I was younger, riding a mountain bike, went out on top of the mountain to the top of the incline, and lo and behold, right up there on top of the mountain were these big blotches of asphalt. And I took one of those, and I've lost it somewhere since then, but it was a big chunk of asphalt that was used for paving the York Highway, and it's some that had spilled out of one of those rail cars. So, lots of connections there, and little personal connections like that too, that my parents and grandparents have told me about, so.
My brother-in-law is named Hagmar Williams.
Yes.
They lived up Delk Creek, and Mr. Hagmar would stop there occasionally and spend the night. So they named a son Hagmar Williams, and he bought him a little red wagon, and he's the only kid in the family that had that red wagon.
Well, he was one of the officials of the O&W Road, Mr. Hagmar. He was the traffic manager and one of the vice presidents of the railroad. So,
As it went down through Wolf River, Delk Creek, which side of the creek was it on, the north side or the south side?
I don't know exactly. It's just about all erased down there now. It's almost impossible to tell once you get into the valley floor where it was once you leave the incline down there. That's been so many years ago too. A lot of time has passed since then. Another little tidbit that just interesting things that popped in my mind, that if you go down to the O&W Bridge, the big bridge over the river, you can see what obviously is a huge boulder, probably as big as this room, big square rock that seems to sit right in the middle of a railroad right-of-way. Well, there was a fellow named O.H. Anderson, who was I think the president of the O&W Railroad, that he was going to open a coal mine down near Leatherwood Ford. There's still a creek there called Anderson Branch. And his idea was to tunnel back into the hillside and have a coal mine, a drift mine they called it back then. The problem was there was no good way to get the coal out. So he had the O&W Railroad start building a spur track from the big steel bridge to Leatherwood Ford. They made it about 2 miles until the fellow that was using the company money to build the right-of-way used all the money in the first 2 miles. He was broke. So all the money was gone. I remember walking down through there and seeing was obviously a well-graded, level, flat railroad track. And then suddenly it just ends out on top of a bluff in a big pile of rocks where they worked the last day. They abandoned the project after that. Then sometime later, that big rock fell off the top of the bluff and landed right in the middle of their right-of-way down there. Now, in years later, they built what is called a pole road. Now, a pole road was actually where they took logs, 6 to 8 inches in diameter. They would overlap the ends and join them together and simply lay them on the ground. Then they had a pole cart, which had big concave wheels, which would ride on top of those poles, so that would keep them from sinking in the ground, and they were pulled by mules or oxen. And so later, there was a pole road there. My grandfather, Peavy House, told me about this. They said, oh yeah, they had a pole road that went down through there. Well, lo and behold, years later, I was down there checking it out, And I still saw some of those poles laying in the ground. And they'd been in a wet spot where they didn't rot too easily. They were made out of, it looked like white oak or something to me. But they had cut each one in half and overlapped it, and driven a spike through it, and joined those poles together. They were still laying on the ground there. So people were very creative and very innovative about getting this raw material out of the woods and where it could be used. And that was just one of the ways they did it. Did whatever they had to do. So, thank you all very much. I've talked enough.
Couple quick things here. We've got a new book out. The way we work, you see our posters we put in the windows and stuff? Well, this was all put out by the Smithsonian, and we've got a book that we've put together of all the pictures that they have used. And that's one book we've got, and I don't know if any of you know Joyce Crouch. She's 98 years old, member of our Historical Society. She now lives in Crossville. But anyways, she just wrote a new book, and it's called Scars of the Civil War, and it's about the life here in Jamestown and stuff after the Civil War, what people had to go through, and some of the different things that have happened in the Civil War, how it tore this county apart. There were so many Union people, and then there was a lot of Southern people, like Confederates, and you know, brother against brother, father against son. There was a lot of problems, especially in this area. So that's about what happened when they come back after the war. So otherwise, we've got some free books over here. We've got membership applications. Help yourself, and I'm glad you're all here. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.